"Look, Dad," shouted the feline boy, his voice filled with excitement. The tall, relatively chubby feline father, Orland, turned with exasperation to see what the fuss was about. He wondered how his parents had managed with him if he had been this much trouble as a child. But as his eyes settled on the sight his son had pointed out, he too was struck with awe. "Dad, is that a human?" the boy asked eagerly, his curiosity piqued. Orland studied the creature's features, taller than him by a considerable margin, with a hairy head, 2 arms, 2 legs, an endoskeleton, and soft skin. It could only be one thing. "Yes, Jal, I think that is a human," Orland replied, his voice tinged with wonder. He glanced around the largely desolate area, wondering what a human could be doing here in the middle of an open field. "Can we go see him?" the boy asked, bouncing with anticipation. Orland, shaking off his shock, said, "Yes, of course. Let's go." They approached the human slowly, who, upon seeing them, turned to face them. He wore an elegant dark vest and dark blue trousers, his expression a bit exasperated. Orland felt a twinge of shame, realizing this human must have been approached countless times by curious beings. But his curiosity outweighed his respect for the man's privacy. "Excuse me," he called out. The human, with gray, curly hair blowing in the wind, turned to face them. "Excuse me, sir," Orland repeated, bowing slightly. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but my child really wanted to meet you." "Hi," Human Jal said, his excitement barely contained. The human smiled and bent down to meet the boy's gaze. "Hello, my name is Keith. What's your name?" he asked kindly. "His name is Jal," Orland replied hastily, trying to ensure his son showed proper respect. "Hi, Jal," the human said warmly. "How old are you?" the boy blurted out. Orland immediately scolded his son for his rudeness, but Keith waved it off. "Don't worry," Keith reassured them. "It's a question everyone asks. I am 152 years old." Orland was stunned. 152? That was older than the Federation itself. His own life expectancy was only 20 years, thanks to technology that wasn't available to most other races. The realization hit him that this human could have met his great-great-great-great-grandfather, and it would have been just a small part of his long life. His thoughts were interrupted by Jal, who exclaimed, "That old?" Keith laughed. "Yes, that old," he said with a smile. But then he turned serious. "In the end, age isn't all that matters," Sir Orland began, but Keith interrupted him. "Please, call me Keith." Orland nodded, feeling a bit embarrassed. "Of course, Keith. I'm really sorry to bother you, but what brings you here?" Keith looked out at the open field and sighed. "I needed to get away from the town for a while. I enjoy being out in the open, away from the office and spaceships. It reminds me of Earth," he explained. Orland and Jal listened intently as Keith paused, lost in thought. After a moment, Keith shook himself out of his reverie and smiled at them. "I'm sorry, but please understand we feel honored to meet you," Orland said, his voice filled with sincerity. "It's not every day we meet a legend. Could you tell us some of your stories? We'd love to hear about your experiences." Keith laughed again, the sound warm and inviting. "Of course. Come with me on a walk," he said. Orland quickly pulled his son closer as they began to walk alongside Keith. "How old are you?" Orland Keith asked, glancing down at the feline father. "I'm 7 years old," Orland replied, feeling a bit sheepish. "And Jal?" Keith continued. "He's 1," Orland said, his voice filled with pride. Keith nodded thoughtfully as they walked. "Most people want to hear about how the Federation was formed," Keith said, a smile playing on his lips. "I take it you want to hear the same?" Orland nodded eagerly. Keith smiled again and began his tale. "But first, do you know why humans are usually at the head of the Federation? Why we lead in industries, mining operations, and even as mercenaries and politicians? It's because of one thing," Keith said, pausing for effect. Orland listened intently, hanging on every word. "We live for so long that we hone our experiences and knowledge to a fine edge." "How long is your education?" Keith asked. 3 years, Orland replied. Keith nodded. "Our schools and universities teach us from our 25th to 31st years." 30 years, Orland exclaimed, his eyes wide with disbelief. "That means an infant human wouldn't contribute to society for more than my entire lifetime." Keith chuckled. "Yes, but you see, that's our advantage. While we may be fewer in number, our combined experience more than compensates. 200 years ago, when we first discovered faster-than-light travel, we realized our greatest asset was our age and experience. Other races may be smarter, faster, or more cunning, but we have lived longer and learned from our mistakes." Keith continued, his voice growing more serious. "During the last Great War, there were two major parties ours, with humans as leaders, and another whose name has been lost to time. What was the name?" Jal asked, his curiosity piqued. Keith laughed softly. "Yes, I was there, but I agreed not to reveal that name, just like every other human who lived through it. They were the shortest-lived, most dynamic creatures in existence. I was 55 then. And I captained one of the dreadnoughts in the fleet during the last great encounter between our alliances. Their fleet's movements were cunning, but we had seen them before. Their torpedoes launched from their great ships, but I knew how to avoid them, remembering tactics from 15 years earlier. They tried to trap us, but our admirals saw it coming. Their cunning was no match for our experience. We won a massive victory that day, losing only a few ships, while 1 trillion lives were lost on their side." Orland listened in awe as Keith described the battle. "If I may ask, what happened to these enemies?" Orland inquired, his voice tinged with apprehension. Keith sighed deeply. "We had a choice: leave them be and risk threatening the survival of our alliance, or cut off their head and create a new one, a federation. We chose the latter." Orland's eyes widened in shock. "You committed genocide?" he asked, his voice trembling. Keith looked down, his expression somber. "No, we didn't. We bombed their homeworlds, yes, but we didn't annihilate them. We relocated the surviving population to the outskirts of the galaxy. We erased their memories, forbidding parents to speak of their past to their children on pain of death. We committed to mass re-education campaigns so that they would never know who they were or where they came from." Jal, confused, interrupted, "Like us." Orland shot his son a warning look, but Keith only smiled sadly. "Yes, like yours," he admitted. Orland's mind raced as he tried to process everything Keith had said. "But why are you here, Keith? Why are you telling us this?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion and fear. Keith looked at Orland with a mix of sadness and determination. "We humans are everlasting, but that doesn't mean we are omnipotent, omniscient, or all good. Our lives are measured not by years but by the memories we carry and the guilt we drown in. I'm here as penance, to correct a sin committed long ago," Keith confessed. Orland's eyes widened as realization dawned on him. "Are we the ones? The ones who can't remember?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keith looked away, his face etched with regret. "Just know that the sins of the father should not extend to the children. It is unfair to judge others by our standards, but a man's sins are his own. I'm here to rectify my mistakes, not those of my ancestors," Keith said, his voice firm. Orland stared at Keith, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had just learned. Keith placed a gentle hand on Orland's shoulder, then brushed it over Jal's head. "Remember, the sins of the father should not extend to the children. We may be everlasting, but we are not gods. We have made many mistakes, and it is our duty to make things right," Keith said softly. With that, he turned to leave, heading back toward the town. "I think I'm done with my walk," Keith said over his shoulder. "I hope to see you again, but because of my condition, I don't believe I will. Farewell." Orland watched as Keith walked away, the weight of the human's words settling heavily on his heart. He pulled Jal closer, unsure of what the future held but knowing that this encounter had changed him forever. As Keith disappeared into the distance, Orland knew that the past was not as distant as it seemed and that the future was far more uncertain than he had ever imagined. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. For every comment that says we will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.